Commanders involved in this historical event. These are all commanders who appeared throughout this operation. Bullet Operator General George S. Patton, Jr., Commanding General, U.S. Third Army. Bullet Operator Major General John B. Wogan, Commanding General, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, Commanding General, XX Corps. Bullet Operator Colonel Carlton H. Russell, Combat Command A Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Colonel Harris M. Molaski, Combat Command B Commander, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, Commanding Officer, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Captain O'Malley, Task Force Commander, C Company, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Lieutenant General Alexander M. Patch, former Commander, U.S. 7th Army, previous assignment. Time, 10:30 hours. Date, April 22nd, 1945. Location, Ischenow, Bavaria, Germany. Weather, clear spring morning, temperature warming to approximately 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Excellent visibility. Units involved: 13th Armored Division, U.S., newly transferred to 3rd Army under General George S. Patton, Jr., assigned to XX Corps commanded by Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker. The word spread through the 13th Armored Division's positions around Ischenow, Bavaria, on the morning of April 22, 1945. With a speed that only military rumor could achieve, General George S. Patton was coming, not just sending orders through staff officers or communicating through radio channels, but personally visiting the division that had just been transferred from 7th Army to his 3rd Army the previous day. Soldiers who had been cleaning weapons or performing maintenance on tanks suddenly found renewed energy for tasks they'd been neglecting, knowing that Patton had a reputation for inspecting everything and missing nothing. A sergeant from a 24th Tank Battalion, whose name wasn't recorded in available records but whose reaction was documented, turned his crew and said with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, "Patton's coming. That means we're either about to get our asses chewed for something, or he's got a mission that's going to be worse than anything we've done so far. Probably both." His crew laughed, but nobody disagreed. Patton's reputation preceded him. A commander who demanded aggressive action, who had no patience for excuses or delays, and who believed that audacity and speed could accomplish what caution and methodical planning could not. Major General John B. Wogan stood outside his command post in Ischenow at 1015 hours, watching the road from the west where Patton's convoy would appear, feeling the weight of command responsibility in a way that was different from combat operations. In battle, you made tactical decisions based on available information and accepted the consequences. But meeting Patton meant being evaluated by a superior officer whose standards were legendary and whose judgment could determine whether your division received critical missions or was relegated to secondary roles in the war's final weeks. Wogan had commanded the 13th Armored Division since its activation, had brought it through training and across the Atlantic, had led it through its first combat operations in the Ruhr Pocket and subsequent drives through Germany. His division had performed well by any objective measure, captured thousands of prisoners, forced contested river crossings, maintained operational tempo that exceeded expectations for a unit with limited combat experience. But, well, might not be good enough for Patton, who measured success by different standards than most commanders and who famously had little patience for divisions that didn't match his 3rd Army's aggressive reputation. Patton's convoy arrived at precisely 1030 hours, 3 jeeps and command car, accompanied by military police motorcycles, moving at speeds that seemed reckless on roads still damaged from weeks of military traffic. The lead jeep carried Patton himself, standing in the front passenger seat despite the vehicle's motion, wearing his distinctive helmet with 4 stars gleaming in the morning sun and carrying the ivory-handled pistols that had become part of his public image. Wogan and his senior staff officers stood at attention as Patton's vehicle stopped, saluting as a 3rd Army commander stepped down and surveyed the assembled division command with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the condition of vehicles visible in the background, the appearance of soldiers who had gathered at respectful distance to see the legendary general, the overall readiness posture of a division that had been fighting for weeks and showed the wear that continuous operations created. Patton returned the salute, then extended his hand to Wogan. "General Wogan, Your division has been transferred to 3rd Army as of yesterday. I've read the after-action reports from your Ruhr operations. Impressive work for a green division. Now, let's see if you can keep up with my veterans. The inspection that followed was vintage Patton, thorough, demanding, occasionally theatrical, but ultimately focused on the fundamentals that determine whether armored divisions could fight effectively or would collapse when operations intensified. Patton walked among tanks from a 46 tank battalion, running his hand along armor, checking track tension, asking crew members direct questions about maintenance procedures and ammunition loads. At 1 Sherman, he stopped and addressed the tank commander, a lieutenant whose name was recorded as Morrison in division logs. "How many rounds of main gun ammunition are you carrying?" Patton asked. Morrison, standing at attention beside his tank, replied, 62 rounds, sir. Mix of AP and ES per standing loadout. Patton nodded. "And how many have you fired in combat?" Morrison hesitated, calculating quickly. "Approximately 40 rounds over the past 2 weeks, sir. Multiple engagements." Patton's expression remained neutral. "Then you've been in real fights, not just parades." "Good. The Germans you'll face in the next week won't surrender easily like the ones in the Ruhr. They'll be SS fanatics, kids who believe the propaganda. You'll need every round you're carrying, and you'll need to make them count." "Understood." Morrison nodded. "Yes, sir." Patton moved on to the next tank, leaving Morrison standing slightly straighter, feeling like he'd been tested and passed some evaluation he hadn't known he was taking. By late morning, around 1,145 hours, Patton had completed his inspection of equipment and positions and had assembled the division's senior officers in a commandeered German building, in Eschenau, that served as Wogan's headquarters. The assembled officers, battalion commanders, staff officers, combat command leaders, stood around maps covering every wall while Patton outlined 3rd Army's operational situation and the 13th Armored Division's role in the coming offensive. "The war in Europe is ending," Patton began, his voice carrying a distinctive high pitch that surprised officers hearing him speak for the first time, but commanded attention through sheer force of personality. "But it's not over yet. German forces are retreating into Bavaria and Austria, try to establish defensive positions in the Alps where they think terrain will favor them and where Hitler Youth and SS fanatics might prolong resistance for months. My job, our job, is to prevent that. We're going to drive into Bavaria so fast and so hard that the Germans won't have time to organize defenses. We're going to cut off their retreat routes, capture their supply depots, and force surrenders before they can dig in." He paused, looking at each officer in turn. "Your division has been assigned to XX Corps under General Walker. In 3 days, you'll begin offensive operation from Parsberg, driving south and east toward the Danube, the Isar, and eventually into Austria. You'll encounter resistance. How much depends on whether the Germans are smart enough to quit or stupid enough to keep fighting. Either way, you will maintain momentum. You will not stop for every roadblock or every town. You will bypass, you will flank, and you will keep moving." Questions. Colonel Carlton Russell, commanding Combat Command A, asked a question that tactical commanders always ask when given aggressive operational timelines. "Sir, what about supply lines? If we're moving that fast, can logistics keep up?" Patton's response was immediate and typical. "Logistics will keep up because they'll have to. You worry about fighting. Let the supply officers worry about fuel and ammunition. If you run low on gas, you capture German fuel. If you need ammunition, you shoot less and maneuver more. Speed is your protection. The faster you move, the less time the Germans have to organize defenses that would cost you casualties if you had to reduce them systematically. I'd rather have a division that outran its supply lines than one that moved so slowly it never needed resupply because it wasn't fighting." It was Patton's operational philosophy distilled to its essence. Aggressive action created its own opportunities, while caution and methodical planning allowed enemies time to prepare defenses that multiplied casualties when they were finally attacked. Whether this philosophy was brilliant or reckless depended on circumstances and outcomes, but it characterized 3rd Army's operations since Normandy and had contributed to some of the most successful armored exploitation campaigns in military history. The meeting concluded shortly after noon, and Patton spent the early afternoon visiting 4 positions, speaking informally with soldiers from various units, projecting the combination of profane tough guy persona and genuine concern for combat soldiers that had made him simultaneously one of the most loved and most hated commanders in the American military. At one position, he encountered a group of tank crews from the 24th Tank Battalion who were eating lunch beside their Shermans. Patton stopped his jeep and walked over, surprising the soldiers who scrambled to attention. "At ease," Patton said, waving them back to their meal. "What are you eating?" A corporal, recovering from his surprise, held up a can of sea rations. "Beans and franks, sir. Same as always." Patton grimaced theatrically. "Terrible stuff. But it keeps you alive, and that's what matters. You men been in combat." Multiple voices responded affirmatively. "Good. Then you know what you're doing. In 3 days, we start the drive into Bavaria. It's going to be fast, it's going to be hard, and some of you won't make it. But the ones who do will help end this goddamn war and go home. So stay alert, support each other, and kill Germans before they kill you. That's all the tactical advice anyone needs." He climbed back into his jeep and drove off, leaving the soldiers looking at each other with expressions that mixed amusement and genuine respect. As Patton's convoy departed Echinot around 1,430 hours, heading back to 3rd Army headquarters, Major General Wogan stood watching the vehicles disappear and trying to process what the visit meant for his division's immediate future. Patton had been complimentary about past performance, but clear about expectations for operations beginning April 26, 3 days away. Barely enough time to complete necessary preparations, resupply, and brief subordinate units on mission details that were still being developed. Colonel Harris Molaski, commanding Combat Command B, approached Wogan after Patton left and voiced what many officers were thinking. "He wants us to drive from Parsberg to the Austrian border in less than a week, crossing multiple rivers, through terrain we haven't reconnoitered, against enemy forces of unknown strength. That's not a plan. That's a hope wrapped in audacity." Wogan nodded slowly. "That's how Patton fights. Speed, aggression, accept risk to maintain momentum. It's gotten 3rd Army from Normandy to here faster than anyone thought possible. And it's also gotten a lot of soldiers killed taking risks that methodical commanders would have avoided. But we're 3rd Army now, and this is what 3rd Army does. So we prepare our forces, we brief the mission, and in 3 days we attack south with everything we have." The evening of April 22nd saw the 13th Armored Division staff officers working late into the night, translating Patton's operational guidance into detailed orders that would guide subordinate units during the coming offensive. Maps were studied, approach routes identified, objectives assigned to combat commands and task forces, coordination established with supporting artillery and engineer units. Captain O'Malley, whose task force would be leading one of the initial thrusts south from Parsberg, received his orders around 2,100 hours and gathered his platoon leaders to begin planning at the company level. "We jump off in 3 days," O'Malley explained, pointing to maps spread across a table in a damaged German house that served as company headquarters. "Drive south toward the Regan River. Force a crossing. Continue to the Danube. Cross that. Keep going to the Isar River. Patton wants us to cover over 100 kilometers in 4 days, while fighting through whatever German forces are between here and Austria. Questions?" A lieutenant from 2nd Platoon, a young officer who had joined the division only 2 weeks earlier as a replacement, raised his hand. "Sir, that sounds insane. We just crossed the Isar 3 days ago, and that cost us 18 killed. Now we're supposed to do it again while moving even faster." O'Malley's expression was grim. "Yeah, that's exactly what we're supposed to do. Welcome to 3rd Army. If you're wondering how Patton could demand such aggressive operations from divisions that had already been fighting for weeks, hit that like button and subscribe. This is the kind of command philosophy that either wins wars brilliantly or creates catastrophes, and you'll want to see how it plays out. The night passed with minimal sleep for officers and senior NCOs who were planning operations, while enlisted soldiers enjoyed their last evening of relative rest before the offensive began. Around midnight, a tank driver from one of the companies preparing for the attack sat outside his Sherman, smoking a cigarette and looking at stars visible through breaks and clouds. Another soldier from his crew sat down beside him. "You thinking about the offensive?" the driver asked. His crewmate nodded. "Yeah, wondering if we'll make it through this one. We've been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever." The driver took a long drag on his cigarette before responding. "Patton says speed protects us. Move fast enough, and the Germans can't set up proper defenses." Maybe he's right. His crewmate was silent for a moment. Or maybe moving fast just means we get killed in different places than if we move slow. Either way, we're still getting shot at. They sat in silence after that, watching stars and smoking, each dealing with fear in their own way, knowing that in 72 hours they'd be advancing south into whatever resistance waited, and that some of them wouldn't survive to see May. The morning of April 26, 1945, arrived cold and overcast as the 13th Armored Division assembled in attack positions around Parsberg, Bavaria, preparing to begin the offensive that would prove whether Patton's confidence in their capabilities was justified or misplaced. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor stood in the turret of his command tank at 0530 hours, watching the battalion form up in the pre-dawn darkness, seeing the exhaustion on faces illuminated briefly by shielded flashlights, and knowing that these soldiers were being asked to do something that violated every principle of sustainable operations: attack aggressively after minimal rest, advance through unfamiliar terrain against unknown opposition, maintain tempo that would strain logistics and equipment beyond recommended limits. But this was Third Army now, and Third Army didn't operate according to manuals written by officers who value caution over results. A tank commander from one of the lead companies approached Delnor's position and saluted. "Sir, 2nd Platoon is reporting that 2 of our Shermans have mechanical issues. Transmission problems that the mechanics say need at least 6 hours to repair properly." Delnor's response reflected the new operational reality they were living under. "Do we have enough operational tanks to execute the mission?" The officer nodded. "Yes, sir, if we redistribute crews." Delnor made a decision without hesitation. "Then redistribute the crews and leave the broken tanks for recovery teams. We cross the line of departure at 0600 regardless." Patton's not interested in excuses about mechanical readiness. The offensive began exactly on schedule at 0600 hours as Combat Command A under Colonel Russell led the advance south from Parsberg along multiple routes designed to confuse German defenders about the main axis of attack and to exploit any weaknesses in enemy dispositions. Captain O'Malley's task force was in the vanguard, moving through morning fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters and made navigation difficult, but also concealed American movements from German observation. The countryside south of Parsberg was a mixture of rolling hills, thick forests, and small agricultural villages that offered countless positions where defending forces could establish ambushes. At 0647, O'Malley's lead tank rounded a curve in the road and nearly collided with a German supply convoy that was moving in the opposite direction, apparently unaware that American forces had advanced this far south overnight. For several seconds, both forces simply stared at each other in mutual surprise. Then a German officer in the lead vehicle raised his hands in surrender and began shouting orders in German. O'Malley's interpreter, a soldier from Milwaukee whose parents had emigrated from Germany before the war, translated. He says his unit surrenders. He asks if we will accept. O'Malley accepted the surrender of approximately 150 German soldiers and their vehicles, directed them to a hastily established collection point, and continued advancing. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 minutes and involved no shots fired, the kind of collapse that Patton had predicted would characterize German resistance when pressured by fast-moving armored forces. By late morning, around 1045 hours, the 13th Armored Division had advanced over 20 kilometers south of Parsberg and was approaching the Regan River, a modest water obstacle that intelligence suggested might be defended but probably wouldn't be held with the same determination that German forces had shown at the Isar crossing 8 days earlier. Forward reconnaissance reported that bridges over the Regan had been destroyed by retreating German forces, but that the river was fordable at several points and that enemy forces on the opposite bank appeared to be withdrawing rather than preparing defensive positions. Colonel Russell, commanding from his position with the lead elements, made the tactical decision to force a crossing immediately rather than waiting for engineers to construct formal bridges, gambling that speed would allow American forces to catch retreating Germans before they could establish new defensive lines further south. At 11:18, Sherman tanks from a 46-tank battalion began entering the Regan River at a ford identified by reconnaissance, water rising to the level of the hull hatches as they crossed. Crews tense because even shallow water crossings carried risks of engines flooding or vehicles becoming stuck on submerged obstacles. The crossing of the Regan River was accomplished by early afternoon with minimal opposition. Sporadic small arms fire from German rear guards who withdrew after brief exchanges. No artillery fire, no prepared defensive positions that required coordinated assault to reduce. It was exactly the kind of operation that validated Patton's operational philosophy. Aggressive forward movement had prevented German forces from establishing defenses that would have been costly to overcome, and the division's momentum was maintained rather than being consumed by set-piece battles for river crossings. But the ease of the Regan crossing created its own concerns among experienced officers who understood that German resistance had to be concentrating somewhere, and that bypassing defensive positions in the interest of speed meant leaving potential threats in the rear that could interdict supply lines or attack from unexpected directions. Major General Wogan, monitoring the advance from his command post that was moving forward to stay within radio range of lead elements, raised exactly this concern during a radio conversation with Colonel Russell at 14:45. You're making excellent progress, but you're creating an elongated salient with minimal flank security. What happens if the Germans counterattack from east or west? Russell's response reflected both tactical awareness and acceptance of risk. Then we deal with it. But Patton's guidance is clear. Maintain forward momentum. Don't get bogged down securing every position. The faster we advance, the less time Germans have to organize anything coherent. The advance toward the Danube River continued through the afternoon and into evening on April 26, with the 13th Armored Division covering an additional 30 kilometers and encountering resistance that varied from non-existent to briefly intense. At 1,734 hours near the town of Straubing, Combat Command B under Colonel Molaski ran into a German blocking position that included anti-tank guns and infantry with Panzerfaust, fighting a sharp engagement that lasted 40 minutes and caused 2 American tanks destroyed and 7 soldiers wounded before the German position was overrun. But 20 minutes after that engagement ended, Molaski's forces encountered a German infantry battalion of approximately 400 soldiers who surrendered immediately when American armor appeared, their commander explaining through an interpreter that they had received no supplies for 4 days, had no communications with higher headquarters, and saw no purpose in dying for a regime that was obviously finished. The juxtaposition, fierce resistance at one position, mass surrender at the next, characterized the chaotic final weeks of the war in Europe, where German military cohesion had fractured to the point that individual unit commanders were making independent decisions about whether to fight or surrender based on local circumstances rather than unified strategy. As darkness fell on April 26th, the 13th Armored Division had advanced over 50 kilometers in a single day of operations, far exceeding the progress that conventional planning would have projected, and was positioned within striking distance of the Danube River, which they would attempt to cross the following morning. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, establishing his battalion command post in a captured German warehouse in Straubing, reviewed the day's operations with his staff and tried to assess the physical and psychological state of the soldiers. They had been moving and fighting for over 16 hours with minimal rest, had consumed 1 meal of cold rations eaten while moving, and were operating on adrenaline and coffee rather than adequate sleep. A battalion medical officer reported at 21:15 that he was treating increasing numbers of soldiers for exhaustion-related issues, men falling asleep while standing, episodes of disorientation, stress reactions that manifested as tremors or inability to eat. "Sir, we need a halt for rest," the medical officer recommended. "The men are reaching their limits." Delnor understood the medical assessment was accurate, but also understood that operational requirements didn't accommodate human limitations. "We halt when Patton says we halt," he replied. "Until then, we keep moving. Rotate crews when possible, let men sleep in vehicles while others drive, but maintain the advance. This is what Third Army does." The crossing of the Danube River on April 27th encountered the swollen, muddy conditions that the division had experienced during their previous Danube crossing days earlier. Spring runoff had raised water levels significantly above normal. Current was strong, and approaches on both banks were churned into mud by recent rains and military traffic. Engineers from the 124th Armored Engineer Battalion worked throughout the morning constructing pontoon bridges at multiple crossing sites identified by reconnaissance. Their efforts complicated by the fact that German forces had destroyed all existing bridges, and that debris from those demolitions created navigation hazards for pontoon sections being positioned. Captain O'Malley, whose task force was designated to make one of the initial crossings, watched engineers work from a position on the western bank and marveled at their competence under difficult conditions. An engineer sergeant, directing the placement of pontoon sections while standing waist-deep in cold water, shouted instructions to his team that were barely audible over the river's noise. O'Malley later described the scene. Those engineers were doing work that was harder and more dangerous than anything we tankers faced, and they did it without complaint, knowing that if they screwed up, soldiers would die when bridges collapsed. We got medals for fighting. They deserved medals for building. The Danube crossing was completed by early afternoon on April 27th, with all of the 13th Armored Division's combat elements transferred to the eastern bank and positioned to continue the advance toward the Isar River. But the physical cost of maintaining Patton's demanded operational tempo was becoming increasingly apparent in ways that statistics couldn't fully capture. Vehicles were breaking down at rates that exceeded maintenance capabilities. Tanks throwing tracks, half-tracks experiencing engine failures, trucks burning through clutches on muddy roads. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point, with fuel trucks arriving at forward positions with tanks nearly empty after consuming their loads, simply reaching units that had advanced faster than logistics could follow. And the soldiers themselves showed visible signs of exhaustion that went beyond normal combat fatigue. Men sleeping while walking, crews making mistakes that would have been inexcusable under normal circumstances, officers struggling to maintain focus during briefings. If this aggressive pace is revealing something about the human cost of Patton's operational philosophy, make sure you're subscribed because we're documenting what really happened, not the sanitized version. A tank driver from the 24th Tank Battalion, interviewed years after the war, remembered April 27th as the day he fell asleep while driving his Sherman, waking only when his assistant driver shook him violently after the tank had veered off the road and nearly collided with a tree. "I'd been awake for over 30 hours, he recalled. My body just shut down. If my assistant hadn't been alert, I would have gotten us all killed." The evening of April 27th brought the division to positions near Plattling, within sight of the Isar River that they would have to cross the following day, the same river where they fought one of their bloodiest engagements just 9 days earlier, where 18 American soldiers had died forcing a crossing against prepared German defenses. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces might attempt to defend the Isar again, establishing positions similar to those encountered on April 28th during the previous crossing, which meant the division might face another costly river assault after 3 days of continuous operations that had already pushed soldiers beyond sustainable limits. Major General Wogan, conferring with his commanders during an evening meeting at 20-30 hours, addressed concern directly. "I know the men are exhausted. I know we're pushing equipment past recommended operational limits. I know logistics are barely keeping up. But we're also 48 hours from potentially ending organized German resistance in Bavaria and opening the route into Austria. Patton wants us across the Isar by tomorrow evening and position to drive on Braunau by April 30th. We're going to do exactly that because the alternative, slowing down, giving Germans time to organize defenses, will ultimately cause more casualties than maintaining momentum." It was cold logic that made sense operationally but felt cruel when applied to soldiers who could barely stand from exhaustion. The night of April 27th to 28th was shorter than anyone wanted, with units receiving only 4 to 5 hours of rest before resuming operations in the pre-dawn darkness on April 28th for the approach to the Isar River. Captain O'Malley, walking through his company's positions around 400 hours before the scheduled attack, found his soldiers in various states of readiness and exhaustion. Some had managed to sleep and were performing pre-combat checks on weapons and equipment with professional competence. Others looked like walking dead, operating on muscle memory and caffeine, eyes showing the 1,000-yard stare that came from sustained combat operations without adequate rest. He stopped beside one tank where the crew was eating breakfast, cold rations consumed mechanically because eating was necessary for functioning rather than because anyone had appetite. The tank commander, a sergeant who had been with the company since its activation, looked at O'Malley and asked a question that everyone was thinking. "Sir, how much longer? We've been going nonstop for 3 days after weeks of previous operations. The men are breaking." O'Malley had no good answer, because he didn't know when Patton would decide they'd pushed far enough or when German resistance would collapse completely, making further advances unnecessary. "Until we're told to stop," he said finally. "I know that's not the answer you want, but it's the only one I have. Cross the Isar today, probably advance toward Austria tomorrow. Then we'll see. The war can't last much longer." The sergeant nodded, accepting an answer that was honest if insufficient, and returned his breakfast, while O'Malley moved on to check other positions and wonder privately whether the rapid advance Patton demanded was saving lives by ending the war faster or costing lives by pushing soldiers past the point where they could function safely. The assault on the Isar River crossing near Plattling on April 28, 1945, began at dawn under conditions that were simultaneously better and worse than the previous crossing 9 days earlier. Better because German defensive preparations were less extensive, worse because the soldiers conducting the assault were operating on exhaustion that made every action slower and every decision more difficult. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, directing his battalion's attack from a position overlooking the river, watched through binoculars as the first assault boats launched at 0615 hours and realized that the infantry paddling across were moving with mechanical efficiency rather than the alert intensity that characterized fresh troops. They were executing the mission because training and discipline demanded it, but the edge that came from adequate rest and proper preparation was absent. German defensive fire opened up as boats reached midstream. Machine guns and sporadic mortar rounds, nothing like the concentrated artillery that had made the previous crossing so costly, but enough to cause casualties among soldiers whose reaction times were slowed by exhaustion. One boat took multiple hits and capsized, soldiers spilling into the cold water. Most managed to swim to the eastern bank, or were pulled from the water by following waves. One soldier, weighted down by equipment and too tired to shed it quickly enough, disappeared beneath the current and didn't resurface. By mid-morning, around 1045 hours, the 13th Armored Division had forced the Isar crossing with lighter casualties than the April 19th assault. 3 killed, 14 wounded, 2 missing, and was advancing beyond Plattling toward objectives deeper in Bavaria. The reduced casualties reflected both weaker German resistance and improved tactical execution from a division that had learned hard lessons about river crossings. But the physical cost of maintaining Patton's operational tempo was accumulating in ways that wouldn't appear in casualty reports. Vehicles were being abandoned along the route when mechanical failures occurred, and no time existed for field repairs. Tanks with thrown tracks, half-tracks with engine problems, trucks that simply stopped running after being pushed beyond their design operational limits. Supply sergeants were performing near miracles, keeping fuel and ammunition flowing to advancing units, sometimes requisitioning German stocks they discovered in captured warehouses, other times stripping fuel from abandoned vehicles to keep combat elements moving. A supply officer, reporting to division headquarters at 11:34, summarized the logistical situation with brutal honesty. "We're running on fumes and prayers. Fuel consumption is exceeding delivery rates. Ammunition is adequate for now, but we're burning through reserves. Food is short. Soldiers are eating 1 meal a day when they should be eating 3. This can't continue indefinitely without the entire division grinding to a halt." The advance toward Austria on April 29th brought the division through increasingly mountainous terrain as they approached the foothills of the Alps, roads becoming narrower and steeper, forests thicker, and potential ambush sites more numerous. German resistance remained sporadic and disorganized, some units surrendering immediately, others fighting brief rearguard actions before withdrawing. Patterns that suggested overall German command structure in Bavaria had collapsed, but that individual commanders were making independent decisions about whether to continue fighting. At 1,323 hours near the town of Simbach, Captain O'Malley's task force encountered a German roadblock manned by Hitler Youth, teenagers who engaged American armor with Panzerfaust and small arms, fighting with fanatical intensity that seemed disconnected from military reality. The engagement lasted 18 minutes and ended only when tank fire and infantry assault had killed or severely wounded every defender. O'Malley, surveying the aftermath, found himself looking at bodies that belonged to boys who couldn't have been older than 15 or 16, wearing uniforms that were too large and carrying weapons they'd probably learned to use only days earlier. A tank commander from his company approached and asked quietly, "Sir, what do we do with the wounded?" referring to 3 German teenagers who had survived with severe injuries. O'Malley's response reflected both military necessity and a kind of weary compassion. "Treat them same as we treat our own wounded. Get medics over here. They're just kids who believe propaganda and paid for it." By the evening of April 29th, the 13th Armored Division had advanced to within 30 kilometers of the Austrian border and was positioned to enter Austria the following day, having covered over 150 kilometers in 4 days of continuous operations that had validated Patton's belief that aggressive armored exploitation could collapse German resistance faster than methodical advances. But the human cost of that validation was being measured in exhausted soldiers who were functioning at levels that medical professionals would later recognize as unsustainable. Men hallucinating from sleep deprivation, crews making errors that endanger themselves and others, officers struggling to maintain coherent tactical planning when their own cognitive functions were impaired by fatigue. A battalion medical officer, documenting cases he was treating during the advance, recorded soldiers who fell asleep during artillery barges, tank drivers who couldn't remember the last time they'd slept, and increasing incidents of what would later be recognized as acute stress reactions, tremors, inability to eat, dissociative episodes where soldiers seem mentally absent even while physically performing duties. "We're winning," the medical officer wrote in notes that will be preserved in archives, "but we're destroying our own soldiers in the process. The question is whether we're ending the war faster or just creating casualties through exhaustion that would have been avoided with sustainable operations." The crossing into Austria on April 30th, 1945, occurred near the town of Braunau, a location that would gain symbolic significance because it was Adolf Hitler's birthplace, though the soldiers making the crossing cared less about symbolism than about the tactical problem of forcing another river, the Inn River, that marked the border between Germany and Austria. German forces had destroyed bridges and established offensive positions on the Austrian side, requiring another assault crossing by soldiers who had already forced 3 contested river crossings in 9 days and who were operating on reserves of endurance that were nearly exhausted. The assault began at 0730 hours with artillery preparation, followed by infantry in assault boats, the sequence now so familiar that it felt routine despite the inherent danger. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, watching the crossing from observation positions on the German side, saw his soldiers execute the mission with professional competence that was remarkable given their exhaustion, and wondered how much longer human beings could be pushed before something fundamental broke. The Inn River crossing was completed by early afternoon with moderate casualties. 5 killed, 23 wounded, and American forces established a bridgehead on Austrian soil that would be expanded over following hours. The occupation of Braunau on May 2nd, 1945, represented a symbolic moment that received attention from war correspondents and higher headquarters, but meant less to exhausted soldiers than the simple fact that they'd survived another day of combat and might finally get rest. Major General Wogan established a command post in the house where Hitler had been born, a gesture that photographers documented and that would appear in newspapers, but the soldiers who had fought to reach Braunau were more interested in finding places to sleep than in contemplating historical ironies. Captain O'Malley, whose task force had been among the first American units to enter the town, gathered his remaining operational tanks, down from the 18 he'd started with on April 26 to 11 still combat effective. The rest abandoned along the route or damaged beyond field repair, and established positions on Braunau's eastern edge in case German forces counterattacked. At 1,645 hours, he received a radio transmission from battalion headquarters. Hold current positions. No further offensive operations until further notice. Resupply and maintenance priorities. It was an official ceasefire, but it was the closest thing permission to stop that they'd received in 6 days, and O'Malley could see visible relief on his soldiers' faces when he passed the word that they were halting in place. The evening of May 2nd brought the first sustained rest the 13th Armored Division had experienced since beginning the offensive on April 26th. 6 days of continuous operations that had covered over 200 kilometers, crossed 4 major rivers, fought dozens of engagements, captured thousands of German prisoners, and accomplished exactly what Patton had demanded when he'd visited the division on April 22nd. The statistical accounting would show moderate casualties given the scope of operations. 43 American soldiers killed during the six-day offensive, 127 wounded, 8 missing. German casualties were hard to calculate, but included several thousand killed in various engagements, over 15,000 captured, and unknown numbers who had deserted or simply disappeared as military units dissolved. But statistics couldn't capture what the offensive had cost the soldiers who survived it. The exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into psychological and emotional depletion, the cumulative trauma of watching friends die in actions that felt increasingly meaningless as Germany's defeat became more obvious, the moral weight of killing teenagers who believed Nazi propaganda and paid for that belief with their lives. A tank driver, sitting beside his Sherman on the evening of May 2nd and finally having time to think about something other than immediate survival, later described the feeling. We'd won. We'd done everything Patton asked and proved we could fight as well as any division in Third Army. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty, like something important had been used up and couldn't be replaced. The days following the May 2nd halt brought gradual confirmation that the war in Europe was ending. German resistance in Bavaria and Austria collapsed completely. Mass surrenders occurred across the region, and on May 7, Germany signed unconditional surrender documents that would take effect on May 8th. The 13th Armored Division remained in Austria conducting occupation duties, processing prisoners, maintaining order in areas where German military authority had vanished, but civilian governance hadn't yet been reestablished. For soldiers who had fought since April, the transition from combat to occupation felt abrupt and disorienting. One day executing orders to attack and kill, the next day guarding prisoners and directing refugees. Captain O'Malley, reflecting on experience years later, described the cognitive dissonance. We'd spent weeks being trained and ordered to be aggressive, to kill Germans, to maintain operational tempo regardless of cost. Then suddenly we're supposed to be garrison soldiers, friendly to civilians, administrative rather than combative. Some guys made that transition easily. Others struggled with it. A few never really made it and brought the war home with them in ways that affected the rest of their lives. The final accounting of what Patton had seen in the 13th Armored Division when he visited on April 22nd, what made him confident they could serve as Third Army's finishing blow in Bavaria, revealed itself not in a single quality, but in a combination of factors that characterize effective armored divisions in the war's final phase. They had tactical competence from weeks of combat experience that had taught lessons no training could replicate. They had aggressive leadership at multiple levels, from Wogan at division level to company commanders like O'Malley, who understood that Patton's operational philosophy required accepting risk to maintain momentum. They had soldiers who were exhausted and scared but who continued executing missions because training, discipline, and unit cohesion demanded it even when individual survival instincts suggested stopping. And perhaps most importantly, they had timing. They arrived at the point in the war when German military resistance was fragmenting, when aggressive exploitation could achieve results disproportionate to the forces committed, when speed mattered more than methodical planning, because the enemy was collapsing faster than formal defensive lines could be established. Patton had recognized these qualities during his April 22nd visit and had given the division missions that would test whether his assessment was accurate. The operations from April 26th through May 2nd had answered that test definitively. What does it mean to be called someone's secret weapon when that person is George Patton, and the context is the final collapse of Nazi Germany? How do soldiers respond when a legendary commander demands performance that pushes them beyond what training manuals define as sustainable, and when the operational results validate that demand even as individuals pay costs that won't appear in after-action reports? When examining the 13th Armored Division's six-day offensive in late April 1945, what stands out is not just a tactical success, rivers crossed, kilometers advanced, objectives secured, but the human dimension of soldiers who were simultaneously proud of their accomplishments and traumatized by what those accomplishments required. Patton's operational philosophy achieved results. The offensive collapsed German resistance in Bavaria faster than methodical advances would have, probably saved lives by ending the war sooner, and demonstrated that aggressive armored exploitation could succeed even against opponents who still possess capability to resist if given time to organize defenses. But that philosophy also created casualties through exhaustion. pushed soldiers past sustainable limits, and assumed that victory justified whatever human costs were necessary to achieve it rapidly. Does history adequately recognize the difference between tactical success and human costs, between accomplishing missions and destroying the soldiers who accomplished them, between ending wars quickly and ensuring that the survivors can successfully transition back to peace? And what did those soldiers of the 13th Armored Division carry forward after the war? Those who had proven themselves worthy of Patton's confidence, who had served as Third Army's finishing blow, who had helped end Nazi Germany, but had paid for that achievement in ways that remain invisible to everyone except those who lived through it. These questions matter because they remind us that military effectiveness and human well-being sometimes pull in opposite directions, that winning wars and caring for soldiers can be competing rather than complementary objectives, and that the cost of victory is measured not just in battlefield casualties, but in the psychological and emotional burdens carried by survivors long after the shooting stops.